Welcome of the dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you like to see recognized, list them in the comments. Contact our author page. Authors, always looking for fresh blood. Subscribe and contact us for more information. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, crush or cut the like button below. Check out our other stories on Rumble, YouTube, and our websites. On Rumble, Bitchute, and YouTube, Dweller of the Dark. Find us on Facebook at Jeffrey LeBlanc, Horror Writer. Official website, jeffreyleblanc.com. You can find our books on Amazon and Kindle. Follow us on Parler, Instagram, Twitter, Dweller of the Dark. And you can support us on Patreon and Bandcamp. Children of Horror. A terrified son tries to save his hypnotized father from the god Anubis. The curse of the Scarabaeus crawls out for a reckoning on a mummy thief. And in New Orleans, a disillusioned writer attends the Mardi Gras and dinner with the Egyptian god Sebek. As we continue to slither through a series of Egyptian tales from Robert Bloch, the Egyptian gods desire you to pass a good time on the bayou, chef, with our latest lurid tale. Our fourth episode is The Secret of Sebek. This terrifying tale was published in the November 1937 issue of Weird Tales and continues our crawl through the Robert Bloch Egyptian series. As stated by Weird Tales, what grisly horror spawned in prehistoric ages in ancient Egypt stalked through the weird house in New Orleans. A tale of the Mardi Gras. This slithering story concerns our narrator's visit to New Orleans during Mardi Gras. While kicking off the festivities, he is invited to Henricus Vanning's special party for the Coffin Club. Our narrator is asked to settle a dispute over a stolen mummy for the god Sebek. Can our narrator warn the Coffin Club in time to avoid the wrath of Sebek? Or will he just run away after dinner, crying crocodile tears? The Secret of Sebek by Robert Bloch. I should never have attended Henricus Vanning's costume ball. Even if the tragedy had not occurred, I would be better off had I refused his invitation that night. Now that I have left New Orleans, I can view the episode in saner light, and I know that I made a mistake. The remembrance of that final, inexplicable moment is a horror that I still cannot face with a rational mind. However, had I suspected beforehand, I might now be spared the recurrent nightmares which afflict me. But at that time of which I speak, there was no premonition to guide me. I was a stranger in the Louisiana city and very lonely. The Mardi Gras season served only to accentuate my feeling of utter isolation. During the first 2 evenings of celebration, tired from long vigils at the typewriter, I wandered alien and alone along the quaintly twisted streets, and the crowds that hustled by seemed to mock my solitude. My work at the time was very exhausting. I was doing a series of Egyptian stories for a magazine, and my mental state was a bit odd. During the day, I sat in my quiet room and gave my mind over to images of Nyarlathotep, Bubastis, and Anubis. My thoughts were peopled with the priestly pageantries of olden times. And in the evenings, I walked unknown amidst thoughtless throngs, more unreal than the fanciful figures of the past. But enough of excuses. To be perfectly frank, when I left the house that third night after a weary day, I expressly intended to get drunk. I entered a cafe at dusk, dining lavishly with a bottle of peach brandy. The place was hot and crowded. The ribald, costume masqueraders all seemed to be enjoying the reign of Momus. After a time, this did not disturb me. 4 generous goblets of the really excellent liqueur had set the blood running like elixir in my veins. Bold, reckless dreams cascaded through my head. I now gazed at the impersonal swarms about me with new interest and understanding. They too were trying to escape tonight, escape from maddening monotony and humdrum commonplace. The fat man in the clown costume nearby had looked silly an hour ago. Now I seemed to sympathize with him. I sensed the frustration behind the mask these strangers wore, appreciated how valiantly they strove to find forgetfulness in the Mardi Gras. I would forget too. The bottle was emptied. I left the cafe and once more walked the streets. But this time, I no longer had any feeling of isolation. I strode along like the carnival king himself and traded jibe for jibe with chance buffeters. Here, memory is temporarily blurred. I went into a club lounge for scotch and soda, then continued on my way. Where my feet led me, I cannot say. I seemed to float along effortlessly, but my mind was crystal clear. I was not thinking of mundane things. Through some quirk, I recalled work again, and I contemplated ancient Egypt. Through crumbled centuries I moved, in visions of secret splendor. I lurched down a dim, deserted street. I walked through temple Thebes while sphinxes stared. I turned into a lighted thoroughfare where revelers danced. I mingled with the white-clad acolytes adorned sacred Apis. The carousing mob blew paper trumpets, strewed confetti. To the shrill litany of lutes, the temple virgin showered me with roses red as the blood of betrayed Osiris. Thus I passed through streets of Saturnalia, my thoughts still wine-wafted and far away. It was all very much like a dream when at last I entered that obscure thoroughfare in the heart of the Creole district. Tall houses reared deserted on either side. Darkened, dingy domiciles deserted by their owners, who mingled with the merrymakers amidst more pleasant surroundings. The buildings were old. In the fashion of ancient days, they stood narrowly together, row on row. They are like untenanted mummy cases in some forgotten tomb. They stand deserted by the maggot and the worm. From the steeply gabled roofs, little black windows yawned. They are empty, like the eyeless sockets of a skull. And like a skull, they too hide secrets. Secrets. Secret Egypt. It was then that I saw the man, threading my way down that black and twisted street. I noticed a figure in the shadows before me. It stood silent, as though awaiting my approach. I endeavored to hurry past, but there was something about the motionless man which arrested my attention. He was dressed unnaturally. Suddenly, shockingly, my drunken dreams were fused with stark reality. This waiting man was dressed like a priest of ancient Egypt. Was it hallucination? Or did he wear the triple-crowned insignia of Osiris? That long white robe was unmistakable, and in his lean hands was the sceptered diadem of Set, the serpent. Overcome with bewilderment, I stood stock still and stared. He stared back, his thin, tanned face bland and expressionless. With a quick gesture, his right hand darted under his robe. I shrank back as he withdrew it once more and pulled out a cigarette. "Got a match, stranger?" asked the priest of Egypt. Then I laughed, remembered, and understood. Mardi Gras! What a scare he had given me, though! Smiling, my head suddenly clear once more, I extended my lighter, used it, and as the flame flared upward, peered curiously into my countenance. He started, gray eyes evincing sudden recognition. To my astonishment, he spoke my name in interrogation. I nodded my head. "What a surprise," he chuckled. "You're the writer, aren't you? I've read some of your recent stuff, but I had no idea that you were here in New Orleans." I mumbled a few words of explanation. He genially interrupted. "That's great luck. My name is Vanning, Henricus Vanning. I'm interested in the occult myself. We should have a lot in common." We stood chatting for several minutes, or rather, he chatted and I listened. I learned that Mr. Vanning was a gentleman of means and leisure. He touched a bit glibly and flippantly on his studies in primitive mythology, but expressed a patently genuine interest in Egyptian lore. There was mention of a social group whose mutual and private researches in metaphysics might interest me. As if seized with sudden inspiration, he clapped me heartily on the back. "What are your plans for the evening?" he said. I confessed my predicament. He smiled. "Splendid. Just had dinner myself. I'm on the way back to the house now to play host. Our little group, I told you about them, is holding a costume ball there. Like to come along? Interesting? But I'm not in costume," I protested. "Doesn't matter. I think you'd particularly appreciate this affair. Most unusual. Come on." He beckoned me to follow and started off down the street. I shrugged, but acquiesced. After all, I had nothing to lose, and my curiosity was aroused. As we walked, the garrulous Mr. Vanning carried on a smooth and intriguing conversation. He spoke in greater detail of his little circle of esoteric friends. I gathered that they rather ostentatiously referred to themselves as the Coffin Club, and spent much of their time in pursuit of exotic and macabre phases in art, literature, or music. Tonight, according to my host, the group was celebrating the Mardi Gras in their own unique fashion, defying the conventional masquerade. All members and invited friends planned to come attired in supernatural garb. Instead of the usual clowns, pirates, and colonial gentlemen, they would represent the more outlandish creatures of fancy and myth. I would mingle with werewolves, vampires, gods, goddesses, priests, and black magicians. I must confess that this news did not wholly please me. I never could stomach the pseudo-occultist or the quack devotee and metaphysicist. I dislike a bogus interest and a sham knowledge of legendary in others. Petty dabblings in spiritualism, astrology, and psychic charlatanry have always been repellent to my taste. I feel that it is not good for fools to mock the old face and the secret ways of vanished races. If this was to be one of the usual groups of middle-aged neurotics and pallid-purple dilettantes, then I would spend a boring evening. But Henricus Vanning himself seemed to have more than a surface smattering of erudition. His cultured allusions to various myth sagas in my stories seemed to hint at deep knowledge and sincere research that peered beyond the blacker veils of human thought. He spoke quite fluently of his delvings into Manichaeism and primal cult ceremonials. I became so absorbed in his words that I failed to heed the direction in which he led me, though I know we walked for some time. When we drew up at last, it was to turn into a long, shrubbery-bordered walk, which led to the doors of a well-lighted and imposing mansion. In simple truth, I must admit to being so seduced by Vanning's picturesque statements that I cannot remember a single concrete detail of the house's exterior appearance or the environs which it stood. Still bemused, I followed Vanning through the open door and walked into Nightmare. When I stated that the house was brilliantly lighted, I meant just that. It was lighted in flaming red. We stood in a hallway of hell. Scarlet scimitars of light scintillated from the surface of mirrored walls. Vermilion drapes cloaked inner entrances, and the crimson ceiling seemed to smolder with the crystalline carmine fires of ruby gas torches that hung in blood-imbrued braziers. A Luciferian butler took my hat, handed me a goblet of cherry brandy. Alone in the red room, Vanning faced me, glass in hand. "Like it?" he inquired. Gay setting to put my guest in the mood. Little touch I borrowed from Poe. I thought of the splendid mask of the Red Death and winced inwardly at this crude and vulgar desecration. Still, this evidence of the man's eccentricity did intrigue me. He was trying for something. I was almost moved when I lifted my glass to the pseudo-priest of Egypt there in that eerie anteroom. The brandy burned. Now, on to our guest. He pushed the tapestry aside, and we entered the cavernous chamber to the right. Green and black were the velvet backgrounds of these walls. Silver the candles that lighted the niches. The furniture, however, was modern and conventional enough. But when I first surveyed the throng of guests, I felt for a moment as if I were again in dreams. Werewolves, gods, and black magicians, Vanning had said. There was more of understatement than exaggeration in that cryptic remark. The occupants of that room constituted a pantheon from all the hells. The orchestra at the corner of the room were dressed as skeletons, and some diabolically clever lighting arrangements made the fantasy uncomfortably real from a distance. The merrymakers circled the floor against the sinister background of ebon and emerald velvet. I saw an obscene Pan dancing with a withered night hag, a mad Freya embracing a voodoo priest, a bacchante clinging lecherously to a wild-eyed dervish from Iram. There were archdruids, dwarfs, nixies, and kobolds, llamas, shamans, priestesses, fauns, ogres, magi, ghouls. It was a Sabbath, a resurrection of ancient sin. Then, as I mingled with the throng and was introduced, the momentary illusion faded. Pan was merely a stout, rather puffy-eyed, middle-aged gentleman with an obvious paunch, which no goatskin girdle could obliterate. Freya was a desperately bright debutante, with the predatory slut eyes of a common harlot. The voodoo priest was just a nice young man in burnt cork, with a slightly incongruous English lisp. I met perhaps a dozen guests and quickly forgot their names. I was a trifle surprised by Vanning's seeming superciliousness. He almost snubbed several of the more talkative. "Enjoy yourselves," he called over his shoulder as he dragged me across the floor. "Those are the fools," he confided in a lower voice. "But there are a few I want you to meet." Over in the corner sat a little group of 4 men. All wore priestly raiment similar to Vanning's own, in that religion dominated. Dr. Delvin, an old man in Babylonian, almost biblical robes. Etienne de Marigny, dark, handsome priest of Adonis. Professor Weldon, a bearded gnome in a calendar's turban. Richard Royce, a young, bespectacled scholar, monkishly cowled. The foursome bowed courteously upon my being introduced. However, there was an immediate slackening of their reserve. They crowded about Vanning and me in a rather confidential way, while our host spoke softly in my ear. "These are the real members of the group I spoke about. I saw the way you looked at the others here, and I quite understand and agree with you. Those people are silly fools. We here are the initiates." Perhaps, then, you wonder at the reason for their presence. Let me explain. Attack is the best defense. Attack is the best defense? I echoed, puzzled. Yes. Suppose now that I and my friends here are really deep students of black magic. There was a subtle suggestion in the way he breathed. Suppose. Suppose that is true. Don't you think that our society friends would object, gossip, investigate? Yes, I admitted. That sounds reasonable. Of course. That's why we formulated our attack. By publicly proclaiming an eccentric interest in occultism and showing it by giving those stupid parties, we are left quite unmolested to carry out our serious work by ourselves. Clever, eh? I smiled in agreement. Vanning was no fool. It might interest you to know that Dr. Delvin here is one of this country's foremost ethnologists. De Marigny is a well-known occultist. You may remember his connection with the Randolph Carter case several years ago. Royce is my personal aide, and Professor Weldon is the Weldon, Egyptologist. Funny how Egypt kept recurring in the course of the evening. I promised you something interesting, my friend, and you shall have it. First, though, we must endure these cattle for another half hour or so. Then we'll go up to my room for a real session. I trust you will be patient. The four men bowed to me as Vanning again led me into the center of the room. The dancing had stopped now, and the floor was covered by little groups of idle chatterers. Demons drank mint juleps, and virgin sacrifices to the Magna Mater artfully applied their lipstick. Neptune passed me with a cigar in his mouth. The gaiety was shrill. Mask of the Red Death, I thought. Then I saw him. It was all Poe, his entrance. The black and green curtains at the end of the room parted, and he glided in as though emerging from the hidden depths of the hangings rather than the door behind them. Silver candlelight silhouetted his figure, and as he walked, a grisly nimbus seemed to cloak each movement. I had the momentary impression of gazing at him through a prism, since the queer lighting made him appear indistinct and sharply etched in turn. He was the soul of Egypt. The long white robe concealed a body whose contours were elusively problematical. Taloned hands hung from swirling sleeves, and the jeweled fingers clasped a rod of gold set with the seal of the Eye of Horus. The top of the robe terminated in a cape collar of black. It stood, a stiffly hooded background, for a head of horror. The head of a crocodile, the body of an Egyptian priest. That head was awful. A slanted, saurian skull, all green and scaly on top, hairless, slimy, slick, and nauseous. Great bony ridges socketed the embered eyes, staring from behind a sickening sweep of long, reptilian snout, a rugose muzzle with great chomping jaws half opened to reveal a lolling pinkish tongue and scummy teeth of stiletto-like sharpness. The saber fangs seemed to move, but it was only a trick of the light. What a mask! I have always prided myself on a certain sensitivity. I can feel quite strongly. Now gazing at that triumph of morbid mummery, I received a sensory shock. I felt that this masker was real, more real than his less grotesque fellows. The very outlandishness of his costume seemed to carry added conviction when contrasted with the pitiful makeshift pretenses of those through which he walked. He seemed to be alone, nor did anyone attempt to converse with him in passing. I reached forward and tapped Vanning on the shoulder. I wanted to meet this man. Vanning, however, swung ahead to the platform, where he turned and spoke to the orchestra men. I glanced back, half intending to approach the crocodile man myself. He was gone. I searched the crowd with eager eyes. No use. He had vanished. Vanished? Had he existed? I saw him. Thought I did. Only for a moment. And I was still a little befuddled. Egypt on the brain. Perhaps I had been over-imaginative, but why the queer flooding feeling of reality? These questions were never answered, for my attention was distracted by the performance on the platform. Vanning had started his half hour of entertainment for the guest. He had told me it was a mere sop to conceal his real interest, but I found it more impressive than I expected. The lights turned blue, haggard, graveyard misty blue. The shadows darkened to indigo blurs as the celebrants found seats. An organ rose from beneath the orchestra platform, and music throbbed. It was my favorite number, the superb and sonorously sepulchral number 1 scene from The Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky. It droned, mocked, shrilled, blared. It whispered, roared, threatened, frightened. It even impressed and quieted the milling geese about me. There was a devil dance following, a magician, and a final black mass ritual with a really terrifying illusion of sacrifice. All very weird, very morbid, and very false. When the lights went up at last and the band resumed their places, I found Vanning, and we hastened across the room. The 4 fellow researchers were waiting. Vanning motioned me to follow them through the curtains near the platform. We made our exits unobtrusively, and I found myself walking down a long, darkened hallway. Vanning halted before an oak-paneled door. A key flashed, grated, turned. We were in a library. Chairs, cigars, brandy, indicated in turn by our smiling host. The brandy, a fine cognac, momentarily sent my thoughts astray once more. Everything was unreal. Vanning, his friends, this house, the entire evening. Everything but the man in the crocodile mask. I must ask Vanning. Abruptly, a voice summoned me back to the present. Vanning was speaking, addressing me. His voice was solemn and held an unusual timbre. It was almost as though I was hearing him speak for the first time, as if this were the real man, and the other genial inhabitant of an open house merely a sham as insubstantial as the Mardi Gras costumes of the guests. As he spoke, I found myself the focus of 5 pairs of eyes. Delvin's Celtic blue, Marine's penetrating Gallic brown, Royce's bespeckled gray, Wilden's deep umber, and the gunmetal pinpoints of Vanning himself. Each seemed to ask a question. Do you dare? But what Vanning said was much more prosaic. I promised you an unusual time. Well, that's what you're here for. But I must admit that my motives are not altruistic alone. I need you. I've read your tales. I think you are a sincere student, and I want both knowledge and advice. That is why we 5 are admitting a comparative stranger to our secret. We trust you. We must trust you. You can, I said quietly. For the first time, I realized that Vanning was not only earnest, he was nervous. The hand holding the cigar shook. Perspiration gathered beneath the Egyptian hood. Royce, the scholarly student, was twisting the belt of his monkish costume. The other 3 men still watched me, and their silence was more disturbing. than the unnatural earnestness in Vanning's voice. What was all this? Was I drugged? Dreaming? Blue lights and crocodile mask and a melodramatic secret. Yet, I believed. I believed when Vanning pressed the lever in the great library table so that the false drawers beneath swung outward and revealed the gaping space within. I believed when I saw him hoist out the mummy case with de Marigny's aid. I became interested even before I noted the peculiarities of the case itself, for Vanning went over to a shelf and came back with an armful of books. These he handed to me silently. They were his credentials. They confirmed all that he had told me. Nobody but a recognized occultist and adept could possess these strange tomes. Thin strips of glass protected the crumbling covers of the ill-famed Book of Iban, the original editions of Cultes de Ghouls, and the most fabulous de Vermis Mysteries. Vanning managed to smile when he saw the light of recognition in my face. We've gone in pretty deep these past few years, he said. You know what lies in these books. I knew. I have written of de Vermis Mysteries myself, and there are times when the words of Ludwig Prin fill me with a vague fright and an indefinable repulsion. Vanning opened the latter volume. You're familiar with this, I believe. You've mentioned it in your work. He pointed to the cryptic chapter that is known as Saracenic Rituals. I nodded. I knew the Saracenic rituals only too well. The account dealt with Prin's mysterious sojourn in Egypt and the Orient, and what he claimed were Crusader days. There is revealed the lore of the Ifrit and the Jinn, the secrets of the assassin sects, the myths of Arabian ghoul tales, and the hidden practices of dervish cults. I had found within it a great wealth of material on the legends of ancient Inner Egypt. Indeed, much story material was culled from those tattered pages. Egypt again! I glanced at the mummy case. Vanning and the others watched me intently. At last my host shrugged. Listen, he said. I'll put my cards on the table. I must trust you, as I said. Go ahead, I rejoined impatiently. Such mystery of manner was irritating. It all started with this book, said Henricus Vanning. Royce here dug it up for me. We got interested in the Bubastis legend at first. For a while, I contemplated some investigations in Cornwall, looking up the Egyptian ruins of England, you know. But then I found a more fertile field in actual Egyptology. When Professor Weldon here went on his expedition last year, I authorized him to obtain anything of interest he might discover at any price. He returned last week with this. Vanning stepped over to the mummy case. I followed. He didn't have to explain further. One detailed inspection of that mummy case, combined with what I knew of the Saracenic Rituals chapter, led to an inference that was unmistakable. The hieroglyphs and markings on the case indicated that it contained the body of an Egyptian priest, a priest of the god Sebek, and Saracenic Rituals told its own story. For a moment, I mentally reviewed my knowledge. Sebek, according to reputable anthropologists, was a lesser deity of Inner Egypt, a fertility god of the Nile. If recognized authorities be correct, only 4 mummies of his priesthood have ever been found. Though numerous statuettes, figurines, and pictures in tombs testify to the veneration accorded this deity, Egyptologists have never fully traced the history of the god, though some unorthodox surmises and wild linkages have been made or hinted at by Wallace Budge. Ludwig Prynne, though, had delved further. I recalled his words with an appreciable shudder. In Saracenic rituals, Prynne spoke of what he had learned from Alexandrian seers, of his journeyings into the deserts and his secret tomb lootings in hidden valleys of the Nile. He told a tale, historically authenticated, of the Egyptian priestcraft and its rise to power, how the servants of the dark nature gods ruled the pharaohs from behind the throne and held the land in their grip. For Egyptian gods and religions were based on secret realities. Strange hybrids walked the earth when it was young, gigantic, lumbering creatures, half beast, half man. Human imagination alone did not create the gigantic serpent Set, carnivorous Bubastis, and great Osiris. I thought of Thoth and tales of harpies, thought of jackal-headed Anubis and the legend of werewolves. No, the ancients trafficked with elemental powers and beasts of the beyond. They could summon their gods, the humans with the heads of animals. And at times they did, hence their power. In time, they ruled over Egypt. Their word was law. The land was filled with rich temples, and every 7th man owed allegiance to the ritual bodies. Incense rose before 1,000 shrines. Incense and blood. The beasts' mouths of the gods hungered for blood. Well might the priests adore, for they had made strange and curious bargains with their divine masters. Unnatural perversions drove the cult of Bubastis out of Egypt, and a never-mentioned abomination caused the symbol and story of Nyarlathotep to be forgotten. But ever the priest waxed stronger and bolder, their sacrifices more outrageous, and their rewards greater. For the sake of life, everlastingly reincarnated, they pleasured the gods and assuaged their curious appetites. To safeguard their mummies with divine curses, they offered up scapegoats filled with blood. Prynne speaks of the sect of Sebek in particular detail. The priests believed that Sebek, as a fertility deity, controlled the sources of life eternal. He would guard them in their graves until the resurrection cycle was completed, and he would destroy their enemies who sought to violate their sepulchres. To him, they offered virgin maidens to be torn between the jaws of a golden crocodile. For Sebek, the crocodile god of the Nile, had the body of a man, the head of a crocodile, and the lustful appetites of both. The description of these ceremonies is grisly. The priests all wore crocodile masks, in emulation of their lord, for that was his earthly aspect. Once a year, they thought, Sebek himself appeared to the high priest in the inner temple at Memphis. And then he too assumed the form of a man with a crocodile head. The devout believed that he would guard their graves, and countless screaming virgins died to support their faith. This I knew, and hurriedly recollected while glancing at the mummy of the priest of Sebek. For now I looked into the case and saw that the mummy had been unwrapped. It lay under a pane of glass, which Vanning removed. "You know the story then," he said, reading my eyes aright. "I've had the mummy here a week. It's been chemically treated, thanks to Weldon here. On its chest, though, I found this." He pointed to an amulet of clear jade, a saurian figure covered with ideographic images. "What is it?" I asked. "Secret code of the priesthood. Mardi thinks it's Nakal. Translation, a curse. As the Prince story has it, a curse on the heads of tomb looters. Threatens them with the vengeance of Sebek himself." Nasty wording. Vanning's flippancy was forced. I could tell that by the restless stirring of the others in the room. Dr. Devlin was coughing nervously. Royce twisted his robe. Mardi scowled. The gnome-like Professor Weldon approached us. He glanced at the mummy for some time, as if seeking solution to a secret in those eyeless sockets that blindly brooded in the gloom. "Tell him what I think, Vanning," he said softly. "Weldon here has done some investigation. He managed to get this mummy in past the authorities, but it cost him plenty to do it. He told me where he found it, and it's not a pleasant story. 9 of the caravan boys died on the return journey, though it may have been bad water that did that. The professor has gone back on us, I'm afraid." "I have not," interposed Weldon sharply. "When I tell you to get rid of the mummy, it is because I want to live. We had some notion of using it in ceremonials here, but this is not possible. You see, I believe in the curse of Sebek. You know, of course, that only 4 mummies of his priest have ever been found. That is because the others repose in secret crypts. Well, the 4 finders are all dead. I knew Partington, who found the 3rd. He was investigating this curse myth quite thoroughly when he returned, but he died before publishing any reports. It was rather curious. His end. Fell off the bridge into a crocodile pit of the London Zoo. When they pulled him out, he was a mess." Vanning looked at me. "Bogeyman," he said deprecatingly. Then in more serious tones he continued, "That's one of the reasons I asked you here to share this secret. I want your own opinion as a scholar and occultist. Should I get rid of the mummy? Do you believe in this cursed story? I don't, but I have felt quite uneasy of late. I know of too many peculiar coincidences, and I have faith in Prin's veracity. What we intended to use the mummy for does not matter. It would have been a desecration great enough to anger any god, and I wouldn't like to have a crocodile-headed creature at my throat. What do you say?" Abruptly, I remembered. The man in the mask. He had been dressed like a priest of Sebek, in emulation of the god. I told Vanning what I had seen of him. "Who is he?" I asked. "He should really be here. It makes things appropriate." Vanning's horror was not feigned. I regretted having spoken after observing his terrified reaction. "I never saw that. I swear I didn't. We must find the man at once." "Perhaps it's a polite form of blackmail," I said. "He may have the goods on you and Weldon and frighten you into paying hush money." "Perhaps," Vanning's voice held no note of sincerity. He turned to the others. "Quickly," he said, "go back into the other room and look among the guests. Collar this elusive stranger. Bring him here." "Police?" suggested Royce nervously. "No, you fool. Hurry, all of you." The 4 men left the room, and their footsteps echoed in the outer corridor as they receded. A moment's silence. Vanning tried to smile. I was in a strange, oblivious fog. The Egypt of my dreams. Was it real? Why had that one glimpse of the mysterious man in the mask so impressed me? The priest of Sebek spilt blood to bind a bargain of vengeance. Could they satisfy an ancient curse? Or was Vanning mad? A soft sound. I turned, and there in the doorway stood the man in the crocodile mask. "That's the fellow," I exclaimed. "That's..." Vanning leaned against the table, his face the color of wet ash. He just stared at the figure on the threshold, but his tormented eyes telepathically conveyed a dreadful message to me. The man in the crocodile mask. Nobody had seen him but myself, and I was dreaming of Egypt. Here, in this room, was the stolen mummy of Sebek's priest. The god Sebek was a crocodile-headed god, and his priests were dressed in his image. They wore crocodile masks. I had just warned Vanning about the vengeance of the old priests. He himself had believed and was afraid when I told him what I had seen. And now, in the doorway, stood the silent stranger. What was more logical than to believe it was a resurrected priest, come to avenge this insult to his kind? Yet, I could not believe it, even when the figure entered, sinister and still. I did not guess its purpose, even when Vanning cowered and moaned against the mummy case. I was not convinced. Then, everything happened so swiftly that I had no time to act. Just as I was about to challenge the unnatural intruder, doom was unleashed. With a darting, reptilian movement, the body beneath the white robe undulated across the room. In a second, it towered above the cringing figure of my host. I saw clawing hands sink into sagging shoulders. Then, the jaws of the mask ascended and moved in Vanning's quivering throat. As I leapt, my thoughts seemed sluggishly calm in contrast. Diabolically clever murder, I mused. Unique death weapon. Cunningly contrived tooth mechanism in a mask. Fanatic. And my eyes, in a detached fashion, observed that monstrous muzzle biting into Vanning's neck, moving. The squamous horror of the head loomed like a camera close-up. It took only a second, understand. Then, with sudden purpose, I had seized the sleeve of the white robe and with my free hand wrenched at the mask of the murderer. The killer wheeled, ducked. My hand slipped and for a moment rested on the crocodile's snout, the bloody jaw. Then, in a flash, the invader wheeled and disappeared, while I was left screaming before the ripped and tattered body on the mummy case of Sebek. Vanning was dead. His murderer had disappeared. The house was crowded with revelers, I had but to step to the door and call for aid. I did not. I stood for one stark second in the center of the room, screaming while my vision veered. Everything was swimming around and around. The blood-blotched books, the sear mummy, its chest now crushed and crimsoned by the struggle. The red, unmoving thing on the floor, all blurred before my eyes. I could see nothing but my right hand, the hand that had brushed the masked muzzle of the killer. There was blood on my fingers. I stared at it and shrieked. Then, and only then, did volition come to me. I turned and ran. I wish my tale could end there, but it cannot. There is a hideous conclusion to be drawn. It must be revealed so that I can know peace once more. I'll be frank. I know it would make a better story if I had asked the butler about the man in the crocodile mask and heard him say that no such person entered the place. But this, God save me, is not a story, but truth. I know he was there, and after I saw Vanning die, I did not wait to interview another soul. I made that last, desperate clutch at the masked murderer, then screamed and ran from the room. I rushed through the revelers on the floor without even giving an alarm, dashed out of the house, and panted up the street. Grinning horror bestrode my shoulders and urged me on until I lost all consciousness and ran blindly back to the lighted lanes and laughing throngs that dwelt smugly safe from the terrors I knew. I left New Orleans without investigating any further details. I purposely did not buy a paper so that I do not even know if the police discovered Vanning's body or investigated his death. I have never attempted to learn anything more, nor dare I. There might be a sane explanation for it all. And then, again, I prefer not to be sure. I desperately try to make myself believe that I was drunk, that the whole incident never happened, or if it did, that part of it was unreal. Even Vanning's death I could bear, but not that legend of Sebek and the mummy case of Sebek. I told Vanning the truth about that, and my belief has been hideously confirmed. Yes, I wish that the stranger in the crocodile mask had never existed. Wish he was unreal. But I know otherwise. The stranger in the crocodile mask of Egypt. I don't care to write Egyptian stories anymore, now that I know. Knowledge came during that last moment when I saw the stranger sink his curiously constructed crocodile muzzle in poor Vanning's throat, sink in with saber teeth slashing. It was then that I grabbed him for a moment before he slipped away, grabbed at him, screamed, and hysterically fled. The murderer was not a priest. Then I knew. Ancient evil of Egypt. Not legend, but truth. I grabbed him in that horrible moment by the bloody muzzle of the frighteningly realistic crocodile mask. Just a single moment of horrid contact before he disappeared. But it was enough. For when I seized that bloody reptilian muzzle, I felt beneath my fingers not a mask, but living flesh. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.